Good evening, everyone. My name is Keith Williams, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. We were founded in 1969 by a small group of hunters, anglers, and naturalists who banded together to acquire and protect our most critical forests, wetlands, and streams, with the belief that some land is so beautiful and rare that it needs to be protected for public benefit forever. Today, over 7,000 acres and 40 miles of trails are open for you and I to enjoy 365 days a year, thanks to their incredible vision. The urgency that drove our founders continues today as we accelerate our efforts to strategically protect and restore more fragmented forests, to expand and connect our existing preserves, and to create new preserves, all while building out infrastructure in parking lots, trails, and signage that allow access for the public, while also protecting these incredible ecosystems. Nature Hour is a virtual education and lecture series with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us better understand both the Conservancy's work and the work of our community and regional partners. Tonight is the beginning of our fall run of shows. If you want to catch any of our past Nature Hours, you can always tune into Conservancy TV via the Lancaster Conservancy YouTube channel. And these are a few of our upcoming events. October 13th, Life Under Logs. October 27th, Chilling and Thrilling Tales of Ghosts and Adventure. And November 10th, Going Batty. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support. And tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors, Clark Associates, Electron Energy, DART, Ritu Associates, Penstone, and Nimblist. Thank you to these companies for your commitment in supporting Lancaster Conservancy's work. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, Planting for Bees, Butterflies, and Beauty. One of the benefits of the Conservancy's work of protecting land is biodiversity protection. We're experiencing an extinction crisis, and the Conservancy's work is a regional solution to this global problem. Ecologists and policymakers have called for the protection of 50% of the Earth's land area in order to protect the remaining biodiversity. Specifically in North America, where there are proposals to protect 30% of the land in the US by 2030. Land trusts like the Lancaster Conservancy, state and federal agencies can't do this alone. We need the help of private landowners to restore their properties for biodiversity protection. That's why tonight's presentation is so relevant and important. The Xerces Society is the premier organization dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates. Tonight's presenter, Kelly Gill, is a senior pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, as a senior partner biologist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, East National Technology Service Center. She provides technical support to the NRCS and landowners for implementing Farm Bill practices to conserve pollinators and beneficial insects. This technical support includes planning, installing pollinator habitat on farms and natural areas. Kelly also works with agency staff and research partners on the development of technical guidelines, outreach materials, and training programs to guide pollinator conservation efforts. Kelly has a master's degree in entomology and wide-ranging experience in habitat restoration for pollinators and other wildlife. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Gill.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to begin to share my screen now. This started here. Okay, is that full screen for everybody?
Looks great, Kelly. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I always feel a little bit bad for somebody that has to spit out the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and Natural Resources Conservation Service. So I really appreciate that introduction, and I'm happy to be here. And with that, let's get to the good stuff. If you don't know about the Xerces Society, you can look us up online. We have a website chock full of different libraries of resources and materials. You can learn more about our mission and our work. Just to summarize what we do, we are a nonprofit organization that protects wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. So as we talk today about different types of pollinator habitat, this also benefits wildlife and biodiversity that was mentioned earlier as well. And so, you know, insects are really kind of the foundation, the bottom of the food chain. They're really integral in all of the functions of our ecosystem. Our work is science-based. We work with diverse partners, including scientists, land-grant universities, land managers, policymakers, educators, farmers, community members, and that really gives us a robust program and also gives us that science-based foundation for the recommendations we give for the resources we develop. We're named after the Xerces blue butterfly pictured here on this screen. This butterfly was a species that was located in the western part of the country near the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was tied to very specific habitat needs. As that area became developed, this was the first butterfly to go extinct in the US due to human activity. So we use this as our kind of reminder to keep fighting the good fight and that our mission matters for all creatures, no matter how big or small. Other than pollinator conservation, which I think people are familiar with our work in that area, we do a bunch of different things and we have a bunch of different programs. A lot of our work is overlapping, but we work on agricultural biodiversity, endangered species, aquatic and watershed conservation, pesticide protection, urban conservation, and then we have some certification programs as well as some community science and engagement programs. Please, if you're interested, reach out to me or look up the information on our website. We won't be able to go through that all today. So we're going to get into the meat of the material now. And this is just a summary slide. A lot of this information is out there and people are becoming more familiar with it. But why do pollinators need conservation action? Well, as you may have heard, they are declining at an alarming rate. There's many species we don't have enough data on. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there are some well-studied species like bumblebees. They're a little bit bigger, a little bit more noticeable. We have historical data on their populations. And from analyzing that compared to current populations and distribution, we know that at least 28% of our native bumblebees are threatened. Some are on the endangered species list, like the rusty patch bumblebee, and some are being proposed for that list as well, unfortunately. Over 17% of all North American butterflies are at risk. They may sound like a small number, but it's almost 150 species. One of the most well-known butterflies facing threats to their population and steep declines in a short amount of time is the monarch. People are familiar with the monarch, so that's a great umbrella species for us to get out there and promote pollinator conservation. Unfortunately, we're seeing a 90% decline since the 1990s. So if we think back to the Xerces blue butterfly, which was a species tied to very specific habitat, isolated habitat, almost seemingly rare, we would expect a species like that to decline. When we think about monarchs being so familiar, so common, widespread, and abundant, only a couple decades ago, that's a really good indication that something's happening. And it's not just happening to our rare and threatened species. So these declines include habitat specialists and formerly common and widespread species like monarchs and butterflies. There are many factors facing pollinator declines. This is just a short list here. A lot of them are interacting and complicated. Habitat loss is something we could all kind of become familiar with, wrap our heads around, and we'll look at some examples. Land management, improving our land management methods and strategies is something else we'll talk about. Resource competition, as we have less habitat, our pollinators are competing for resources, right? Pesticide risk, exposure to drift, insecticides, herbicide drift, taking out important habitat plants. Disease, I am not a pathologist. There are a lot of scientists studying that, but most people don't have a laboratory or the ability to do that on their own. And then things like climate change, as well as invasive species pressure, land use change, all of these factors weigh in. The one thing we can really wrap our head around and do something about is habitat loss. So it's not just pollinators that are declining. We are seeing an increasing number of studies showing declines in insects around the world from all different families, all different species, all different groups. A worldwide compilation of long-term studies found 24% decline in insect abundance over 30 years and 50% over 75 years. So that's in somebody's lifetime, right? It's a scary figure. And since we're going to talk about habitat today, we'll just look at some of the widespread causes of habitat loss. So just removal of habitat, habitat degradation and fragmentation, little islands of habitat being further apart. Animals have to search longer for food. They lose their foraging efficiency. They may lose important habitat features that help them complete their life cycle. Invasive plants pushing out our native plant species, reducing the diversity of plants or bloom times in our landscape, land use change, development, energy sprawl, loss of farmland. In some of our landscapes, our farms are our only open habitats left, and they could harbor very important plants and habitats for animals like bees and butterflies that largely use these early successional open grassland habitats. But we do have a lot of species that are tied to our forests as well. So removal of forests is definitely a problem. And then overall loss of biodiversity. So this is just one example. The US loses about 5,000 acres a day to real estate and energy development. Okay? And we need diverse habitats. We need that biodiversity to support our different pollinators. We can't just rely on one pollinator species. We need that redundancy in our landscape. And most people focus on the honeybee as kind of the model pollinator, but we actually have 3,600 species of native bees in the US, 5,000 in North America, and they're all very different. And in fact, the majority of bee species do not live like honeybees at all. Honeybees are kind of an unfair model for most of our species, and we'll go over that a little bit. We have about 800 butterfly species that occur in North America and north of Mexico. And then we have other flower visitors like flies, moths, beetles, wasps that all play a role in moving pollen. So they're moving pollen from the male part of the plant to fertilize the female part of the plant for reproduction, right? And they're doing this because they're feeding on the plant. That's their food. So as they move from plant to plant, they'll incidentally drop some pollen grains off. Bees are a little different because they have evolved to be vegetarians and feed on flowers throughout their entire life, as in their immature stage and adult. They actually collect pollen. So they are going out to collect pollen to provision their nests, raise their next brood. And in that process, they drop a lot more pollen off. So there are really our premier pollinators, at least in this part of the country, or part of the world, I should say. So recognizing what's a pollinator and what is not a pollinator can be difficult. As you can see here on this slide, here is just kind of a snapshot of the different shapes, sizes, colors, and forms our pollinators take on. Some of them are very small, black, a few millimeters. They're not striped, they're not amber. They almost look like gnats or flies. Bumblebees are pretty recognizable. They're kind of the fuzzy teddy bears of the insect world. They have a lot of really interesting behaviors. We also have shiny green bees that may be mistaken for a fly. We have very, very fuzzy large bees. And then we have a bunch of species that are kind of in between. So when you're looking at this picture, you can say, oh yeah, these look like bees. I can see pollen on their legs or on their bodies. That's a telltale sign that it's a bee and not a wasp or a fly. But when you're out in nature and they're zooming around on flowers and they're not big blown up pictures, it makes it even more difficult. Okay. So we have a lot of bees out there and we need them all. They all do different things. Some of them are very specialized in the plants they pollinate, and there's only maybe one match for that plant. Others are able to, visit and feed on a lot of plants and therefore are pollinators of a lot of plants, including our crops. Since they're so widespread, they really need landscape scale conservation. So this can be a problem, but it's also an opportunity. It's hard to target our conservation efforts to one area like we can for some other species that have, a narrow geography, but we can't do that for pollinators, right? And right now, only 3 to 5% of the American landscape is undisturbed habitat for plants and animals overall. So unless we modify how we manage and how we use plants and landscaping in the places we live, work, and play, we're going to continue to lose this biodiversity. And that's not going to be good, especially if we add in all the other beneficial insects and the services they provide, which we are not going to be able to talk about today. So pollinators need your help. I am going to stop. I know that was a sad story, kind of a bleak beginning, but you have more power than you think you might. Creating habitat is something most of us can do or contribute to, right? Unlike animals that have minimum area requirements, things like grassland nesting birds or polar bears or big megafauna, pollinators can really benefit from small scale habitat plantings, small gardens, container plants. Of course, we want to shoot for the stars and have diverse meadows and hedgerows, but really all of these little efforts can add up. So small spaces can contribute to conservation. Pollinators make this very accessible across different types of landscapes, from urban to rural. And all of these local efforts can make big impacts. So what do pollinators need? This is kind of the basic biology here. When we're thinking about how to conserve something, we need to know what that particular animal needs to make it through their entire life cycle and produce, subsequent generations. So just like back in, basic biology, same things humans need: food, right? In the case of pollinators, nectar, pollen, host plants, water should be included there as well. Nest sites, overwintering sites, and refuge. I think in the winter, we think, pollinators are out of sight, out of mind. We'll talk about that and the importance of those types of habitat in a little bit here. Protection from pesticides and habitat disturbance, direct harm. And then just to reiterate, supporting pollinators through their life cycle is critical. So the first thing people think about is, what should I plant? Right? That's the exciting part: planting flowers, gardening. Gardening is the biggest hobby. And so people can really relate to this. So for pollinators, if we want to have high quality habitat, we want to focus on native perennial plants adapted to the site that you're planting on and the local conditions. We want to make sure those plants also have high pollinator value. There are some flowers that don't. They may have a low value. So we want to really target those heavy hitters, what we call the ice cream plants for bees, prolific nectar and pollen producers. We want to make sure that we select a combination of species so we have a succession of bloom period. Some pollinators are active spring through fall, some only in the spring, some only in the summer, some only in the fall. So we need to have flowering plants on the landscape through that entire period. Butterfly host plants, ease of establishment, availability and cost. You may look at one of our plant lists and say, oh, Kelly, this plant's not on there. And I know it's just the best plant and it attracts droves of insects. Well, it may be something that's difficult to find either by seed or live plants or both. And so that becomes frustrating when you tell somebody that's what they should be planting and they can't find it. So we want to make this really kind of easy and intuitive for people. So what does that succession of bloom look like? Here in the Northeast, it starts with our spring ephemerals when we still have an open forest canopy. And then that transitions into spring blooming trees and shrubs, which are very, very valuable and I think often overlooked. In the summer, we get this familiar meadow type habitat with our herbaceous species. We have a lot of diversity in this part of the season, from the monarda to coneflowers to black-eyed Susan to milkweeds, echinacea. And then we're going into fall like we are now. We start seeing goldenrod and ironweed and asters and our late blooming plants that are really important for monarch migration, preparing for overwintering, and just feeding a diversity of pollinators this time of year. Of course, we want to include our host plants, like I mentioned earlier. I'll use monarchs as an example. We put milkweed in our plantings, the obligate host plant for caterpillars. We try to always include it, so long as we know that it will, establish well and grow on that site. There are plenty of other plants that support, pollinators, including butterflies and moths, such as our forest species. So don't discount the importance of trees and shrubs when you're thinking about how you want to plant or what you want to plant for pollinators. As well as native grasses and sedges. We have a group of butterflies, the skippers, that use grasses and sedges as their host plants. These plants add diversity. They add another functional group to a habitat. So you have, forbs or wildflowers and legumes and grasses. They also provide structural diversity. Some bumblebees like to nest in our bunch grasses, so they provide a nesting site. They also have other environmental benefits, reducing erosion, helping water infiltration, and so on. So plants bloom everywhere, but pollinators need the right type of flower. As I mentioned earlier, there's lots of flowering plants. You may plant them for a variety of different reasons, but if you're planting for pollinators, not all species are going to do the trick. Right? So the ornamental garden varieties, like you see in this picture here, often are bred for, aesthetic purposes. So they may have double flowers or different colored petals or foliage. And in that process, some of the native characteristics of that plant are bred out. So showy double petals replace anthers, the part of the plant with pollen. A lot of these plants are clones. Many have little or no nectar, or the nectar is inaccessible. They're often annual species, not locally adapted, so they're short-lived. They don't create long-term habitat. And people say, oh, Kelly, I have a lot of flowers in my yard, but I haven't seen any pollinators. There's no visitors. Well, you have to assess that situation and say, are these plants attractive? Are they offering resources to pollinators? Maybe, maybe not. And again, making sure your plants are not pre-treated with insecticides. And we have some information online about that. So here's just a quick example. Bees see differently than we do. They see in the ultraviolet spectrum. So when you change the color patterns of plants, you're changing the cues that attract them to that plant, or the way the plant advertises, right? It's a symbiotic relationship. The plant wants to advertise to the pollinator, so it's visited and pollinated. And then the pollinator benefits from food. So you can see here in the first column of pictures where we have the dandelion, that's how we see our dandelions, but bees see it differently. They see in that different color spectrum, and They have these things called nectar guides on the flowers, which is this kind of runway part here. That's an advertisement. It says, hey, here's the nectar right inside here. Come to me and visit me for the benefit of both of us. When you change that, it alters those guides. It confuses pollinators, or it just is not attractive to them anymore. They're not seeing those cues that they would see in a straight species. All right, so talk a lot about flowers when we talk about pollinators, but I want you all to know what we think of as pollinators, these kind of flying insects that are visiting flowers, active during the summer. That's true, but really, if we think about our native species, they spend most of the time in their nest. And most of our solitary native bees are ground nesters. So really, they're soil-dwelling insects for most of their life. And that's important because, like I said, we need to contribute when we think of our conservation planning to the entire life cycle of that species, right? So most of our native bees are solitary. In fact, most bees in the entire world are solitary, about 90%. There are very few species like honeybees and bumblebees that live socially in a colony. Most are solitary. A single female builds a nest, provisions a nest, lays eggs, and so on, right? So think of it as a single family home for each bee. And you can see here they're nesting in different types of soil environments, open soil, this grassy area. I often find them on south-facing slopes where there's sparse vegetation. Those areas warm up in the morning. Soccer fields and parks where areas have been worn away, creating little gaps in the sod, are really great places to look for ground nesting bees. And the way you can protect them is you can't really build their nests. They kind of nest where they want to. But if you see this picture in early spring, know that it is not a wasp. They are bees. Wasps are active later in the season, and they are gentle, non-aggressive, non-stinging. They don't defend their nests like social species. So they're nothing to worry about. Avoiding plastic, mulch, landscape fabric, even heavy layers of wood mulch that block those nest entrances is a great way, an easy thing to do to help them access these nest sites. Avoiding tillage and other ground disturbance. The nests are at different depths. Some of them will escape tillage, some of them won't. Using different materials like pebbles and like light rock mulch can encourage nesting of some species, but very heavy, thick layers of treated mulch can repel them. And again, they're not aggressive. So here you see a female starting to dig her nest here. Our other native bees, about 30%, the other proportion, nest in a variety of cavities. Stems and wood are some of the more common materials. And this can be hollow or pithy stems, old holes that are bored in a tree, maybe from beetles or other insects. Rotting snags, logs are really, really great, not only for these cavity nesting bees, but other cavity dwelling species, birds and things like that. And then we have bees that do things differently than everyone else, and they nest in things like snail shells, right? And this varies by species. In these nests, they construct tunnel partitions. So oftentimes you don't see them going to and from the stem, but you may see some evidence of them being there. One thing to look for is cut circles around the edges of your plants, in particular plants with waxy leaves. This is what our alfalfa leafcutter bees or leafcutter bees use to line their nest. So if you see this, you will know that there's potentially, a a stem nest in your area that is being constructed. It doesn't harm the plant, right? It's not plant damaging, just taking a little bit, and they line their nest like a cigar. So people often ask, how do we protect these nest sites, or how do we promote these? And unlike ground nests, we can do something, right? We can plant species with those hollow or soft stems that bees will nest in. You can leave flower stalks intact over the winter. There are bees nesting in there, and they could be at different stages depending on the species. They could be in a pupal stage, they could be in adult stage, but they're spending that dormant season in those stems, and they'll either emerge as an adult or go through more metamorphosis stages and emerge the next spring. You can prune your plants in the spring to create nest sites. So if you could see in this picture here, cutting these standing stems that have been standing all winter, so they have an entrance hole. Some bees need a pre-made hole to get in. Some of them will excavate that pith of the stem. Cutting them at a variety of heights is important. Watching for activity, that's the fun part, right? And then if you do cut these stems down, bundling them and leaving them in the landscape so those bees can emerge is important. And we have a whole publication on this that also includes kind of this nice little timeline here that tells you some of these management activities that you can do in each season. And what the bees are doing during that time. So not only do you know what are the best steps to take to, manage your garden, manage your landscaping for these nest sites, but also you can, look for that particular bee activity or become familiar with what bees are doing, which is super cool. Then you can impress your friends. Then we have our bumblebees, which people are pretty familiar with. We have about 45 species in the US. They nest in a variety of insulated cavities, and they do have colonies. They are social, but their colonies are annual. So they don't overwinter. The workers do not overwinter with the queen like honeybees. At the end of the season, there's another round of mating. And about this time of year, the rest of the colony will die off. The newly mated queen will leave the nest and find an overwintering place, which is often in just a small pocket of soil or maybe a crevice in a rock wall. And that's very important she be protected because she's the one who is going to lay eggs in the spring, right? So they can nest in places like underground cavities, overgrown field borders, bunch grasses, brush piles, old rodent burrows, under vegetation, tree cavities, rock piles. They really like junked cars. They like to use the material from the inside of the seats, the stuffing, to create nests. So if you have a broke down car, in your yard somewhere, you could put a habitat sign on it, call it good. But they're really opportunistic, and what they do depends on the species, and there's variation within. But they will leave that nest site, hibernate somewhere else, and that single female mated queen will emerge again in the spring and start all over. So here's just some pictures of what those areas might look like. Tall, a strip of unmown grass along a rock wall. Okay. And then we have, pictures like this. Maybe some people might think this is messy or, unmanaged, but it has a lot of really wonderful habitat features here. We have these standing stems. We have this rotting log here, right? That's going to not only host pollinators, but beneficial insects. A lot of our species that are predators of pest insects like lady beetles, green lacewings, variety of predatory insects will hibernate or take refuge under loose bark or in that rotting wood itself. And then we just have that variety of ground cover and structure as well. So people might not look at this and say, hey, that's pollinator habitat, right? Because they're thinking about flowers. So I like to use this cheesy joke that says, don't just be a flower weather friend, because these animals need habitat in the winter too. They're overwintering in areas that aren't ideal sometimes, and having extra ground cover like standing stems or areas that are not mown down to the ground, like a lawn, is critical for insulating those overwintering sites. All right, so this doesn't look like great habitat, right? This is what our landscape is becoming. It's very sterile, not a whole lot of flowering plants here, but we can change that, right? And so we often think of wildflower meadows. These are kind of the habitat installations I work on frequently, larger meadow plantings. And they're very difficult to establish by seed. You need some time, equipment, and energy and enthusiasm. But we can take these concepts and scale them down, right? I know this is still not scaled down too far, but I wanted to show this because there are options for those neighborhoods I showed earlier where you can use, the back part of the property to plant flowering species, native forbs, native shrubs. This is one example here where you see a housing community with penstemon and spiderwort blooming early in the season. I just think it's so much more beautiful. I would love to sit on my deck and look at this instead of a mowed lawn. Building habitat in small spaces is certainly doable. The same big picture concepts apply. Planting plants with a range of bloom periods, using native species, naturalized species like our herbs, culinary herbs, things like mint and thyme and oregano are great pollinator plants as well. Obviously, we want to avoid planting invasive species, including nesting features, making these habitats or spaces multi-purpose. So this is just a planting that was recently installed at the community center here in my town. And you can see there's grasses, there's some flowering plants coming in. There's this nice kind of nesting feature here. There's some rocks and bricks around here and some signage. And this looks a lot more vibrant today. That was a picture from a while ago. So some things to think about versus planting large meadows or other types of plantings like hedgerows and buffers. When you're working in small spaces, there are some different considerations. Selecting fewer species, right? So you're not going through the garden catalog or the native seed catalog or plant catalog and picking one of every one of your favorites. Clumping like species. So you get these clumps of flowers, a larger floral display is really valuable for pollinators because it's easier for them to locate. And then they can fly from flower to flower on that same plant and collect a lot of food in a short period of time versus going from, the zinnia over here to the other one plant over there, because each time they learn how to work that flower. So as soon as they go to a flower of the same kind, they get faster at it and better at it. And they could collect more food to provision their nests, right? And spend less energy doing so. Using those native bunch grasses for structure, usually, kind of the rule of thumb, this is pretty variable depending on the spread of the plant in some cases, but clumping 2 to 5 flowering plants together, so planting them close together, and then interspersing grasses or sedges, 2 to 3 plants depending on the spread. We do want to avoid some of our very tall, aggressive, warm season grasses in these situations. And again, avoiding those pre-treated plants. We don't want to create a toxic environment when we're trying to do something beneficial. And transplants will need irrigation to get started. Okay? So make sure you have access to that. Here's a nice little garden planting that I visited. You know, here you can see some other features that they thought about, and I like these kind of things to think of. You know, planting smaller statured species along walkways or roads or paths or areas that need to be kept open. Our taller plants can flop over sometimes onto these areas. And so if you have a tall plant with an open space next to it, it can lodge and flop over. And then someone might complain that, you know, your goldenrod's hanging over on the sidewalk or the path is not clear. And of course, we need to keep some of those things like sideways clear for people to navigate. Keeping some lawn, you don't have to get rid of it all. Having some negative space, so having some small spaces in between for accessing, you know, those ground nest sites. Maintaining borders and edges. I think one thing that people can do to make their native planting be perceived as less messy and is to, you know, put a stone or rock or wood border around it and make it look purposeful. And then add some people features so you can get out there and sit in those habitats and watch, you know, the visitors come and go, watch things change in your garden. That's when you really, when you take the time, that's when you see these small animals that are really significant part of our ecosystem. So I'm going to go through real quick here and just look at some examples, you know, building a border of herbaceous plants, including woody plants around the perimeter of a little spot of lawn here. Planting fruiting trees and shrubs, right? They benefit you. You can grow fruits like blueberries, elderberries, currants, garden herbs, and also support pollinators. Tiny pocket meadows, and here you can see a good example of those borders. So a scaled down version of the meadows I showed earlier. Climate smart landscaping. You know, a lot of our flowering native plants have nice long root systems. They are really good for promoting water infiltration. They're more resilient against fluctuating conditions. Here you see some little rain gardens, native plant rain gardens coming off a parking lot. Tiny office gardens. One of this picture is from the office garden in the building I go to for work or used to go to for work. And I spend my lunch period out there and just document tons of different things. Again, some little rain gardens and plantings. This is, you know, outside of a sports bar. This is in a parking lot. I know this isn't flowering at this moment, but it does get pretty floriferous and showy. Also intercepts that runoff from the street. Planting around detention basins. Often, you know, it's kind of a bare berm. Woody species can be great there too. Some of our shrubs are riparian shrubs. Teeny tiny little sidewalks or boulevard plantings, right? You don't need a lot of land. Trees and shrubs are critically important. I think they're often overlooked because people are interested in this concept of a meadow, a wildflower meadow. But one tree, one flowering native tree can have, you know, an acre's worth of flowers on it at one time. So if you have a small space or a small linear space, especially, you can really do a lot by building hedgerows or building, you know, a narrow linear planting that looks something like this. This is button bush, and you see some bergamot in there and other species. Nice and showy. And don't forget about building up. You know, you don't have to build out. You can layer your plantings so you have, you know, herbaceous flowering plants at the ground level. You have shrubs and small trees. You have canopy trees and things in between. It's a great way to create habitat niches in a smaller space. Including all these nesting features. It could be very simple. Here's some gardens with some snags in it. Adjusting mowing, not mowing fields especially if milkweed is present during the times monarch caterpillars are on the plants, right? They can't escape like adults can. And there's a nice map online. I'll have a resources slide at the end that will show all these links, and I could share that with you. And leaving the leaves, these are areas where our butterflies overwinter or lay eggs on. They really need that protection. So if you could keep some of them at least and spread them on your flower beds or use them as mulch or pile them up behind the garage, that would definitely be more conducive to the next generation than shredding them or bagging them and sending biodegradable material in a plastic bag to the dump where we send lots and lots of yard waste. And so this is just a fun study here where they found, these things that we are doing to manage our lawns are really detrimental to the environment. This is probably no surprise, but I really like the quote in this article that said, you can drive this Ford F-150 Raptor around in your yard, and that's a more green option than using this two-stroke leaf blower, which emits more pollutants than this giant vehicle. So using that for, about a half an hour in your yard is equal to, almost a 4,000-mile trip in a truck, from Texas to Alaska. So these changes that we're trying to make really have a lot of benefits beyond pollinators and wildlife in general, right? Adding signs, getting involved in your community. I lived a long time in an apartment complex where I couldn't do anything. I wasn't allowed to plant things. They had a lawn company come. And so, I would take opportunities to do plantings in the park, helping, community groups, going out there and trying to find these opportunities where I may not be doing it in my own yard, but I'm helping the greater good. And then we have some programs where you can, create a committee in your town or county or burg, wherever you live. It's called Bee City USA. We also have a campus program related to that. And this is how you can get your town to be a bee city instead of a tree city, right? So similar kind of wording, but it's a way to kind of motivate people to get together and make some changes and do native plantings and think about pesticide use in the town, do outreach and education around this, and just get more people involved and understanding. And here, if you are not a dot on the map, you definitely should be. So visit our Bee City site and see how you can get involved and lead your town, to become a bee city, a certified bee city. With that, I'm wrapping up here. We have a ton of resources regionally on our Pollinator Conservation Resource Center. Click on the map. You can find so much stuff. If you're looking for something, we likely have it, and it's just hard to find. We have a YouTube channel and also webinars on our website with a variety of topics, everything from, youth programs to technical how-tos. And then just visiting our Get Involved, tab on our webpage, supporting our work, becoming a Xerces member, those are all things you can do to promote pollinator conservation. Every little bit adds up, right? And with that, I'll end there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wow, that was amazing, Kelly. Thank you so much for all that information and the hope, right? There's a lot of hope attached to this, I think. So just as a reminder, folks, if you have any questions for Kelly, just type them right into the Q&A section right there, and I'll make sure I get to them. But for starters, and I think you answered that with one of your last slides, I'm assuming that folks, if they want some of the resources that you've mentioned, can just go to the Xerces Society website and access most of those resources there.
Absolutely.
Excellent. And then, one of the big questions that I had that somebody else also had, as somebody who tries to do native plantings, is finding a source of native plant material in my region that's native to my region that's not a cultivar. So maybe that's a two-part question. Can you comment on the idea of a cultivar and how you can tell if it's a cultivar? And what are some sources that we can use to locate native nurseries and native plant materials?
Yeah, so on our website, if you click on your region of the map on our Pollinator Resource Conservation Center, and I'll put some links in the chat box here. One of the drop downs is local native plant nurseries. So some of them sell, live plants, some sell seeds, some sell both. And that's a great place to start. Also, your local native plant society chapters will have that information on their website, or often do. I'm pretty sure Pennsylvania does. I know New Jersey does. So these are kind of vetted sources where, we've talked to these people. We know they have good plant materials. We've asked them to, have insecticide-free plants available and a variety of native plants. Some of them will be cultivars or nativars, and you can tell because they'll have a little extra name on them. So instead of just, being a goldenrod genus species, it might say, the genus species plus fireworks or another descriptive term. And they're not all bad. Especially if the flower color and structure has not been changed, and same with the leaf color and structure. So some of them are attractive to pollinators, but there is some variability there. So.
Great. Yeah, thanks. And also for folks that are more local to Lancaster, the Muhlenberg Society is a good resource, a good native plant organization resource. And also the Conservancy does have a community wildlife habitat program. So if you go to our website, and I think Kelly Snavely just popped a resource from the Conservancy website into the chat for folks that are more local. But you mentioned something that got my interest, and it also got somebody else's interest, is insecticide-free plants. How can you tell if a plant that you're getting from a nursery is in fact insecticide-free?
You can't. I mean, you can't tell by looking at it. Some of the big box stores, after, people putting pressure on them, said that they would label their pre-treated plants. And they did. And the label says, this plant is treated with neonicotinoids to prevent harm from insects like, white flies and aphids and other things that you might recognize as pests. Which, yes, it does do that, but nowhere on it does it say harmful to pollinators. So it's labeled, but you also have to know that, that it's harmful to pollinators without it saying so. So it's a political kind of workaround. And then a lot of our native plant nurseries grow their own plants. They know their pest management program, and they can help answer those questions. Somebody at a large garden center where they're getting plants from, all over, the country, they don't know how they were grown. And so on our website, we have 2 new publications: Buying Bee Safe Plants and Selling Bees or Offering Bee Safe Plants, which that publication has some advice on how to talk to your nurseries.
Great. And then, are there suggested pairings of fruits and vegetables along with native flowers that both attract the pollinators, but then also serve the benefit of pollinating those fruits and vegetables?
So, well, of course. I mean, if there's a blooming fruit tree like an apple tree, a bee is really likely going to go to that mass food source. So if you have, a farm or even in your yard, if you have certain crops you're growing in your garden, making sure that you have flowering, blooming plants before and after your crops are blooming, and then just a variety of flowering plants really will bolster that, that pollinator community. Give them some nest sites and they'll take up residence right there in your garden.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And speaking of nest sites, so I thought that was really interesting that, some of this is as simple as changing the timing on some basic garden management things like cutting stems or clearing leaves. We've got a specific question. Is it ever acceptable to burn off areas where pollinators are established? And does the burning destroy the insect? And I'm assuming that might be time dependent, right? Timing dependent?
Yes. So when we do habitat management, in particular on a large scale, burning is a great tool. It's a way to invigorate floral diversity in our meadows that tend to go grassy over time. It's underused, but it's a great tool. And no matter what management method we're using, whether it's burning or mowing or whatever else, we apply that in the rule of thirds. So we only disturb a third of that planting per year, which, yes, there is some detriment. There definitely is some fatalities,
Yeah.
but 2/3 of that remains staying for insects to escape for refuge and protected habitat. So these things need to be managed, but we also need to think of how we can do that and balance the risk and the benefit.
And related to that, can you have a comment on bee boxes and bee hotels? So I've read conflicting reports, and the most recent data looks like that said that some of those may actually be detrimental to bee survival than helpful.
Right. Yeah. So there's all kinds of, it's like a bird box, right? You have to clean your bird box. You have to make sure it's free of parasites and things like that. Same thing with the bee houses. They can build up a reservoir for disease or parasites when they're used over and over again and not either swapped out or cleaned out. If you have one or two for demonstration, as a learning tool or just because you like to watch it, no big deal. If you have a lot of them in close proximity, then you can really incur some risk on the species that are using that and then going out into the wild and passing it on to, maybe a mason bee that's nesting in stems or something like that. So, and lots of things will nest in those boxes too, not just bees. So they're kind of cool, but really it's just mimicking what you can do in your garden naturally, right?
Great. I think we have time for one more. What can you say about fall pollinator plants? I know solidago, goldenrod you mentioned. Any other fall plants that are really great for pollinators?
Yeah, so, right now in my garden, I have some asters blooming. Goldenrod, of course, is one of the heavy hitters. There are other things, right now I have a mist flower that's petering out a little bit. I have some sunflowers, so some of the later blooming native helianthus species. Sneezeweed is a later blooming species, ironweed. There's quite a few fall bloomers or late season bloomers, and you'll see those on the lists that we have online. They're divided up by bloom period.
Wonderful. Kelly, again, thank you so much. And folks, if you're interested in seeing some of those plants up close and personal, we do have an interpretive event this Saturday at the Kelly's Run Pollinator Park. So part of the Kelly's Run Preserve has been restored into a pollinator demonstration garden. And we're going to spend a couple hours wandering through that, looking at some of those plants, looking at some of those fall pollinators that are still very busy, by the way, stocking up for the winter time. And again, we've got a number of additional nature hours coming up this fall. We're excited for our fall lineup. The Conservancy is so blessed with our corporate sponsors. None of this would be possible without their support from Park Associates, Electron Energy, DART, Ritu Associates, Penstone, and Nimblist. Thank you all so much for joining us. Stay tuned for additional programs this fall. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Feel free to reach out. And thanks for having me.